At 4 in the afternoon, the apple she had packed that morning sat untouched, a silent witness to a different choice. Her hand reached for the chocolate bar not with defiance, but with a kind of weary surrender. She wasn't hungry, and she could still picture her morning intention to eat well. The decision didn't feel like a victory of desire over will. It felt like the will had already gone somewhere else. What erodes a resolution so completely? Not through crisis, but through the slow friction of an ordinary Tuesday. For decades, psychology has offered a simple and powerful answer. Self-control is like a muscle. Every act of resisting temptation, every hard decision, every moment of biting your tongue draws from the same limited reservoir. By late afternoon, the reservoir runs low, and the brain defaults to easier, more impulsive choices. That explanation has a name. It is called ego depletion, and it has shaped how millions of people understand their daily struggles. It seems to match experience perfectly. Mornings feel fresh, evenings feel heavy with bad decisions. But as researchers looked closer, the muscle metaphor began to stretch and tear in unexpected places. The trouble started when scientists couldn't always find the same effect twice. One of the most famous demonstrations placed people in a room with warm cookies and a bowl of radishes. Some were told they could eat the cookies. Others had to resist and eat only the radishes, a quiet act of self-control. Afterward, both groups worked on a difficult, frustrating puzzle that secretly measured how long they would keep trying. The radish eaters gave up much sooner, as if their self-control had been spent just by resisting the cookies. The implication was profound. Self-control seemed to drain a common mental resource, leaving less for anything else. This finding spread far beyond the lab into business, education, and personal productivity advice. But when other laboratories tried to replicate the effect with larger and more rigorous methods, the pattern became murkier. Some studies found a tiny effect. Many found nothing at all, even when the procedures were nearly identical. The idea of a simple willpower tank began to look like an oversimplification. If willpower doesn't simply run out like fuel, what else could explain the feeling of mental exhaustion? One clue came from the brain's energy consumption, a hypothesis that self-control actually burns glucose. Early experiments suggested that a sugary drink could briefly restore performance after a demanding mental task. But here, too, the story grew more complicated. It wasn't the sugar itself, because simply tasting something sweet without swallowing could sometimes have a similar effect. Even the belief that you were getting glucose could be enough to alter your persistence. This raised a more unsettling possibility. The sense of depletion might not come from a physical resource at all. Psychologists began to explore whether fatigue is a signal from the brain about the value of continuing. The brain constantly monitors the balance between effort, reward, and competing opportunities. When a task stops feeling rewarding or when other priorities loom, motivation to continue drops sharply. What we call willpower depletion may not be a tank running dry. It may be a careful calculation that the current effort is no longer worth it. That shift from resource to motivation changes the entire meaning of the afternoon chocolate bar. Consider two people facing the same mid-afternoon temptation after a hard day. One believes willpower is a limited resource that depletes with use, and she monitors herself for signs of fatigue. The other believes willpower can be replenished or even expanded through effort, like a skill. Dozens of studies have shown that people who hold the second view actually show less depletion on subsequent tasks. Their performance doesn't drop off as steeply, even after demanding self-control challenges. This doesn't mean they have unlimited willpower, but that expectations shape the very experience of mental fatigue. The belief that you're running out can become the reason you stop, a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the effect isn't just about conscious beliefs. It's woven into how the brain interprets bodily signals. a heavy feeling behind the eyes, a sense of wanting to quit. Those sensations can be interpreted as exhaustion or as a momentary dip in motivation. The interpretation determines whether you take a step back or push forward. What about the role of habits and environment? Self-control in the lab is often measured in isolation, but real life is messy. The person who ended up with the chocolate bar wasn't just depleted. She was in a room where the candy was visible and within reach. Her morning apple required opening a fridge and washing it, a tiny but real extra cost in a tired moment. Some researchers propose that what depletes is not a resource but the cumulative mental fatigue of making many choices, a phenomenon called decision fatigue. Every time you decide what to eat, what to wear, how to respond, you draw on a limited pool of decision-making energy. But even this pool may be less about a physical substance and more about a shift in priorities. After many decisions, the brain seeks shortcuts. So the issue isn't weakness of character. It's a strategic recalibration by a brain that wants to conserve effort for what matters most. Our central figure didn't wake up intending to fail. Her brain simply started valuing short-term comfort over long-term goals as the day wore on. That recalibration can happen outside conscious awareness, leaving us feeling as though our will is being stolen. So far, 3 layers have emerged: the muscle metaphor, the energy account, and the motivational shift. Each layer explains some data, but fails to fully account for the complexities of real human self-regulation. The muscle metaphor captures the feeling of effort, but falters under replication tests. The glucose account points to a physical mechanism, but doesn't explain why mere belief can override it. The motivational account offers the deepest insight, but risks sounding like a dismissal of genuine struggle. If willpower fatigue is about motivation, it might seem like people just aren't trying hard enough. But that would be a mistake, because motivation itself is shaped by history, mood, biology, and the structure of daily life. A person who has faced a high level of chronic stress or discrimination may experience a different threshold for reward, making effort feel more costly. Now return to that moment at 4:37, with the apple forgotten and the chocolate wrapper crinkling. She doesn't know about meta-analyses or glucose debates. She just feels the familiar guilt of another failure. But notice that guilt often assumes a simple story. I have a limited tank and it ran out on me. The guilt doesn't ask whether the tank was really empty or whether her brain simply stopped investing in the long goal. What if the exhaustion isn't a signal that you cannot continue, but a signal that your brain is questioning why you're continuing? This is the reversal. Willpower fades not because you can't, but because your internal value assessment has shifted, often without your awareness. You're just listening to other signals, cravings, social cues, fatigue, that tilt the cost-benefit equation. The critical insight is that the equation can be rebalanced, not by sheer force, but by changing the inputs. When you expect depletion, you watch for it, and the first sign becomes permission to let go. A laboratory study gave people a difficult task and then measured persistence. But first, half the group watched a video suggesting willpower is unlimited. This isn't about magically becoming superhuman. It's about the story your mind tells about your capacity. If you interpret difficulty as a sign to stop, you stop. If you interpret difficulty as a challenge that can be met with a different approach, you search for that approach. The fading of willpower is not a mechanical leak, but a directed message from a brain that is always asking, is this worth it? The message is not a fixed verdict. It can be renegotiated by shifting your attention, your environment, or your framing of the effort. This doesn't mean you should ignore real fatigue or push through dangerous extremes. Genuine biological needs remain. But on an ordinary difficult day, the feeling of depletion can be a prompt to check what you're telling yourself about the value of your goal. The woman with the chocolate bar could, in that instant, pause and ask a simpler question. What does my body actually need right now? Sometimes the answer is a brief rest, a small joy, or a change of scenery, not a moral failing. The exhaustion she experienced was real, but its meaning was more flexible than the muscle metaphor allowed. If willpower is a story we tell ourselves, we are not its passive victims. We are its co-authors, along with our habits. Understanding this can turn guilt into curiosity and helplessness into experimentation. She could reach for the chocolate bar tomorrow and notice that her brain isn't empty. It's just asking an old, reflexive question. This insight doesn't erase the need for good habits, structure, and rest. It suggests that the feeling of fade can be a signal to adjust your strategy, not a verdict on your character. Simple environmental changes, moving a temptation out of sight, or making a healthy choice the easier default, can reduce the need for heroic self-control. And perhaps most powerfully, examining your beliefs about willpower can reshape your daily experience of effort. Changing that belief alone through reflection and small successes can gradually alter the arc of an afternoon. The woman who felt defeated by the chocolate bar could, tomorrow morning, place the apple on her desk within arm's reach. When the slump arrives, she might take a short walk, play a song, or briefly connect with a friend, actions that signal to her brain that the day still holds reward. None of these adjustments rely on gritting her teeth. They rely on understanding the conversation between her environments, her thoughts, and her biology. Willpower, it turns out, is less a muscle and more a negotiation. And negotiations can be reopened at any moment, even when you think the deal is already lost. The science is still unfolding, and not every question has a settled answer. But we know enough to treat the feeling of depletion not as a broken resource, but as a meaningful signal that deserves a thoughtful response. As she crinkles the wrapper and feels the first pang of guilt, she might also feel a new sliver of possibility. The apple is still there, and the day is not over yet. Not because willpower is infinite, but because the story isn't finished until you stop writing it.